Ben Pearson, the Roadster Tracker here, and I want to use a new game that was recently given to me as an opportunity to explain some concepts that I hear talked about with SpaceX in particular and with some other rocket companies as well. This game is called EarthX. It is basically SpaceX the Video Game. That's how you can kind of think about it. You have a bunch of different things. You're managing launch contracts. This is basically a brand new version of the game. You can see you start out in 2002. As you go on, you're able to start doing stuff like building reusable rockets. You're able to build bigger rockets to send humans into space, to send cargo to the space station, build link satellites, which hint those are actually Starlink, and other similar things with the end goal of getting to Mars. In fact, if we pull up the milestones here, you can see here what some of these are. So you can make a prediction and hopefully things will happen at a semi-reasonable time. The end goal is even to ultimately terraform Mars. So we'll see how that goes, but I want to use this to kind of explain some concepts because there are definitely some big misconceptions out there about some of the stuff that SpaceX is doing. And this game is, while it's very much a fan-based game, it does take into account some things that have to be a little bit more realistic than many fans out there assume. So I'm just going to go ahead and continue this and build some stuff. One of the things that I find a little bit unrealistic, but you have to do it for a game, you just build and stockpile rocket bodies. It doesn't really matter what you're going to use them for. Well, that kind of sort of works. Each one is actually specifically tailored to a mission. So we're going to go ahead and launch something. We're just going to be a wimp and launch a concrete rocket because we have a 50% chance of blowing up, and that wouldn't be fun. So we're just going to go ahead and do this and hit the launch button and see if we have any kind of success. Now, one of the things that's interesting with this game is it has a concept of just a number of types of orbits. You have landing on Mars, you have Mars orbit, low Earth orbit, medium Earth orbit, geostationary orbit. And I think there may be a lunar system as well. But that's it. The truth is every orbit is very distinct. You can have a low Earth orbiting thing that goes around the equator is a very, very different thing than one that goes around the poles. The inclination is absolutely critical. If you're going to launch something rideshare, you all have to be going to the same inclination. Otherwise, it's just not going to work very well. You can actually put something in a higher orbit fairly easily, whereas a lower orbit, not so much. So something to keep in mind. It's made simpler because it's a game, and I totally understand that, but it would leave a little bit to get all the inclinations right. It'd be nice if they could do that kind of thing as well. Another thing that kind of drives me nuts, we have multiple launches here that are happening. It doesn't really matter in this game where you have launch from. Again, I understand it's a game, you got to make some compromises, but your launch site will very much determine what kind of orbits you can do. Never mind this test firing engine, that's just something that happens later on. But in this game, like if you had a polar launch system, you'd still be able to launch any kind of orbit that is desired, which is not something that really works in real life. So it's something to keep in mind, and yeah, we want to make sure we address that for the real life, and that's one of the big things that SpaceX has to worry about. Getting close to the equator will allow you to do any kind of orbit as long as you can launch in the proper direction, and that is something that we try to aim for when we're designing this kind of thing. So at this point in time, we have medium rockets that can carry 7 cargo. That's kind of an arbitrary unit. As long as you're launching to the same orbit, as you can see here, the low Earth orbit, you can put as many payloads on there as you can. There again, this would all assume that they go to the same inclination. If you get to the same inclination, you can adjust the plane that they're in. So one of the easiest inclinations to think of is sun synchronous, which means that you fly over at the same time of day. If you have a sun synchronous orbit where you're flying over at, say, 6 a.m., it's relatively easy to change that to a 7 a.m. It takes a little bit of time. You raise or lower the orbit appropriately, and eventually you'll get to your new orbit. But that isn't really possible to do with a different inclination. The maneuvers are extremely expensive, and it's not something you want to do. So if you're going to make this work in real life, you could send to multiple altitudes at the same inclination. This is pretty common. SpaceX had a big rideshare mission that was on a Falcon Heavy that had like 5 different orbits that things got deployed into. They were all basically the same inclination, but some of them were a little bit higher than the other ones. And so that's how it was able to do that. So we'll go ahead and launch this, and hopefully this will be successful. It's still a new medium rocket, so it doesn't work as well as I would like. But yeah, I'm sure. Of course, we blew up our first rideshare, and so we lost tons of cash. Lovely. One of the things I like that this game has gotten right is as you go from launching and landing on a landing pad, as you increase the mass, eventually you'd reach a point where you have to go to a drone ship. Now, at this particular point in time, I don't have a drone ship available, so if I'm going to launch this rocket, I'm going to lose it. And the payload capacity also drops just a little bit, which is kind of interesting. But we're going to launch this one and try not to lose the rocket, because that will be a helpful thing, I think. So one of the problems that SpaceX is facing that also happens in Earthy is you get to a point where you just don't have very many missions to launch. And eventually you just have to start developing your own spacecraft to make it. So in here they call them gigafactories, which is obviously more of a reference to Tesla. But we're going to build one of these if we have funds, which we do. And then we can start building our own little Starlink satellites. We'll build 2. I haven't figured out the orientation trick. They just seem semi-random. We're going to build 2 of those so we can start building a couple of batches of Link satellites at a time. And then we'll start to see some of the stuff that happens with the actual Link satellites. You can see here we're capturing the fairings. Of course, that proved to not work very successfully. They just go fish them out of the water right now. So as I mentioned here, as we have things right now, there are a bunch of different orbits. The ISS counts as an orbit, although it's kind of different than some of the other ones. But we have to launch these separately. And in reality, if you're going to the ISS, you could probably drop something off there as well. But yeah, we're going to fly a little robot to the ISS, because why not? And I guess the robot's quite popular. But you have to pick these different orbits, which is true, but unlike this game, it's not the altitude that really affects things. The altitude affects the capacity, which isn't affected at all in this game. But what it is really important is the inclination. Oh, but it's so cool to see the rockets firing all at once. I always like to just fire a bunch of them all at once in this game. It's pretty fun. So in order for Starlink to be useful, you have to build a ground terminal. Now in this game, you can just build them wherever. It doesn't really matter. But in reality, at least for now, you have to build them relatively close to where you want to be able to provide internet coverage. So the internet coverage for Starlink is not that great at the moment, because especially in the Midwest, there's a band where it's low visibility because they just don't have the terminals that are available there to make the coverage. This is something that is going to be becoming less of an issue when the Starlink satellites are able to talk to each other. But it's still worthy of some consideration. There's going to be some countries like China that you will have to have a dedicated terminal that only operate within that terminal, because China likes to quarantine the internet. So it's not like you're going to be able to do everything, and you still have to follow the RF rules to be able to make that happen. But we're going to go ahead and build a few of those terminals. So we have just started to actually operate Link, and right now I'm charging a fairly high amount because we want to somewhat limit the number of users. Our capacity is very, very limited at the moment, especially in the terminal area, but we'll get to that one in a moment. We can just build more of those terminals, and that would allow us to make that work. The thing, though, is these terminals have to be kept into account. And notice this number here of only 1 million. There's going to be a very limited amount of Starlink capacity. You're not going to be able to have 100 million people in the United States have Starlink. This is really a internet system that is set up for people who are in rural parts of the world. It will work fantastic for those areas. But like for me, I pay like $60-70 a month for a gigabit. I have a faster connection that would cost less than Starlink and less hardware. So why would I get Starlink? And it will degrade the capacity for those people who really need it if too many people who are in cities get it just because they can. One of the fun things I like is it actually keeps track of where the drone ships are. So you just saw there that I couldn't launch and land on a drone ship, and this actually requires a drone ship. So yeah, that was pretty neat, and you had to wait a little bit until the drone ship was available, and then we could launch and not have any issues. So one of the things I'm working on right now is basically Starship, except for they call it Spaceship. And you have to go through this series of tests just like the real Starship does. And every time you blow up a rocket, and trust me, they will blow up. In fact, we'll probably see this one blow up. Then you have to start all through the test again. Did we actually make it? Whoa, we made it without blowing up. Nice. Once we can get to the 20-kilometer hop and have one of those successful, then we can actually build ourselves a Starship. So now we can go on to, the next level of testing. They didn't do... Well, they had a 20-meter hop for Star Hopper, which had its own little thing. It's... Like I said, this is basically SpaceX the game. I mean, there's no question that it is very heavily inspired by fans of what SpaceX is doing. So, yeah. But it's pretty neat, and I like the fact that you have to go through all of those tests just like the real Starship does. Meanwhile, I am launching a bunch of rockets to try to keep things under control. This is definitely a game where you have to keep a lot of things on task, and you see this one blew up, so we have to start all over again for a Starship. Oh well, it happens. One of the interesting challenges with this game is you have to be very careful about how you build up, and you're controlling the flow of things. And you can see here that I did not succeed this particular round. I did longer on my version that I streamed, but that's... So I restarted to show you guys a couple of things in the late game. I love how you can see all of the link satellites that are all over the place. There's some really interesting things here that I think this does well. I kind of hinted before. Right now, we're having to manage the link capacity and the terminal capacity. But as things stand right now, it's really, really difficult to build enough links to really satisfy any kind of progress. And we're kind of tapped out at a relatively small number of users. While it would be nice to extend this a little bit further, it's just really difficult to do. You have to start making these satellites nonstop. We have, where's the number? 9,000 links. They're going to have 40,000. I'll do a whole video on this at a separate time, but it's going to make things a lot more complicated. You can see here we're getting well along our research path. We're starting to land things on Mars. And if we click on this button, first time you do it, it has a really cool little music sequence, and you get to hear the voice that I presume is the creator of this. So we have our first little Starship here that has landed by itself. Spaceship, yeah, whatever. Same thing. So we're going to turn this off for a sec on pause. We're going to add in some landing pads so we can land some more. The first one you'll land for free. The other ones you have to start paying with some materials that we brought with us. These actually cost a fair bit of money, although I don't understand fully why that is. We're going to put a few solar panels as well, because at this point in time, everything is already on Mars, but I guess they got to balance the game somehow. If you want the music sequence, yeah, I have streams of this that are on my secondary YouTube channel. You can take a look there. You can see some of the satellites I've launched. I love that it keeps track of all of that. Let me just launch another batch here while we're talking some more. One of the things that I can do now is to launch into multiple orbits. And as I mentioned before, you can see some are GEO, some are MEO. The capacity doesn't really change, which is not particularly realistic, but it's kind of interesting. We'll just go ahead and launch. The launch costs for a Starship launch, of course, are quite cheap. So we're going to go ahead and take full advantage, not launch any concrete though. We can launch some more materials to the surface of Mars. These have to be done with a cargo super heavy. Materials, you need to build stuff, you have to make them, which is kind of a pain, but you know, it happens. We can see the number of contracts is starting to go up. I think this will actually happen, but it's going to take a while to really support Starship, and the prices haven't really gone down, which is pretty realistic, I think. Yeah, we'll go ahead, launch some of these LEO stuff. A couple of other interesting things. You can start to launch these massive payloads, and you kind of bulk launch a single Starship has a thing. If I was going to do this game, my critique is I would like to see the mass of the spacecraft be the only thing of concern, and depending on what orbit, it will make it so you can carry more or less mass to each of these. If you're trying to land it, you're going to have less mass. I think that would make it a lot easier overall. And easier and more realistic. I understand why they don't do it fully realistic. You can see the number of Starlinks is absolutely absurd, but even right here, this is a fairly high number, fairly realistic model, and you can see there's only a handful of these link satellites that are in the area. Each one of these, roughly dozen or so, will have to carry the load of whatever it happens to be orbiting over. It seems like it would be a really, really difficult thing to have anything more than a relatively modest amount of people that are talking at any one time. Another thing that you can also do with this game is to keep track of the Earth-to-Earth stuff. So right now we're sending packages. We have some rough crew. We know that you can probably send more people per flight. And packages, that's probably pretty reasonable. That sounds even maybe a little bit light still there too. But they don't instantly make a lot of money. I assume this is really revenue, whereas this is the operational cost, and we're not really making any money. If we check our company logs here, we can see we're making a lot from services, which I assume is mostly Starlink, and some from launches. Of course, everything else just eats up cost, but something to consider as well. So we have the Matt rescue mission, which we're trying to save somebody who's presumably on Mars. I think this is actually Matt Damon, as in Mark Watney in The Martian. Lots of fun Easter eggs like that all throughout there, all kinds of stuff, space community online, etc. And it's really great in that sense. One of the things that really amuses me is the parking orbit. This is the orbit of spacecraft where they're waiting to head towards Mars. You can see right now we've got 4 of them, and they're in here. Tankers will be launched, I think, automatically to come dock with them, and they will eventually head on their way towards Mars, assuming they are able to get fully fueled. Love the little glints that happen too. That's pretty neat. But you can have a limited number of spacecraft in here. I guess that's them firing their thrusters to maintain course or something. But it's a pretty neat concept, and I guess it works. You can only actually launch towards Mars once every 26 months, so they had to do something to allow you to launch whenever you wanted to, and I think that's a reasonable way to make things happen. Well, at this point in time, we have landed cargo on the surface of Mars. Some things to note: we have cyber cars, which are obviously cyber trucks, and a bunch of other stuff. We're refueling spacecraft. We're starting to launch them. We have a nice little base, and we have to worry about these dust storms, which are annoying, but that's not too bad. The end part of this is a little bit weak, I got to admit, but overall, I really do enjoy the game, and I encourage you guys to check it out. Probably we'll do some more videos on some of this stuff later, but for now, thank you guys for checking this out. Take care, and until next time, keep on tracking.